I'm John Wilker, the organizer of 360 IDEP. I hope you enjoy this session recording, but first I wanted to mention one thing. We've served the community since 2009, and over the past few years we've had to take on debt in an effort to keep the conference alive. After several unforeseen challenges, not the least of which is a pandemic of indefinite duration, we've had to make the hard choice to end the conference as we're now facing over $100,000 in debt. As a result of requests from the community of how they can help, we've created a GoFundMe campaign. If you're inclined and able, please consider donating to help keep 360 IDEP going. The QR code after this will link you to the campaign. Thank you. Enjoy the recording.
So before I get started, last year I brought a bunch of puzzle cubes, what you may call Rubik's Cubes, and I offered to teach anyone who's interested how to solve the 3x3 cube. We also had a little tournament with prizes, and I promised to do it again this year. So as such, I'll have all these cubes in the lobby tomorrow, and you should come see me if you want to learn how they work or enter an official tournament time. I'll have prizes for sort of pro and amateur divisions, and I'll have also 4x and 5x cubes, and the deal is that if you can manage to solve a 4 or a 5 by the end of the day, you can keep it. So now without further ado, let's talk about technology and the brain in a talk that I'm calling The Importance of Neuroplasticity. So as technologists, we have an interesting relationship with technology because we're primarily concerned with creating things that will make it easier for people to do their work and live their lives. But at the same time, we also rely on technology to do our work. We rely on technology like Xcode to tell the computer what to do, and instruments to tell what the computer is actually doing. And of course, we also rely on hardware. We all need computers to program, and some of us further rely on medical hardware to make it possible to work or even live. Rarely do we get to talk about technology that touches on all these things, but that's what I want to bring you today. Insight into a piece of technology that has not only improved my life, but literally made it possible to continue doing my job. And I'm bringing it to you not only because I suspect it might also improve your lives and your ability to do your jobs, but also because I see opportunities for people who focus on making good technology to make this technology better and more accessible. At its core, we're talking about a piece of software that utilizes existing medical hardware to trigger the brain's built-in mechanisms for permanent healing of several common psychological complaints, including anxiety, stress, attention deficit, brain fog, lasting fatigue, and trauma, including emotionally inaccessible childhood trauma. The process is called neurofeedback because you are allowing the brain to see itself. You accomplish healing by engaging in neurofeedback training with a neurofeedback therapist using neurofeedback software hooked up to a machine called a QEEG, or quantitative electroencephalograph, which reads your brain waves and converts them into numbers. From a software standpoint, if you want to provide neurofeedback therapy, you're probably going to be doing it on Windows because there is little to no Mac software out there, let alone software for iPad or eyeglasses. There's opportunity there, both in the current professional medical setting and in developing a market for self-treatment in a personal home setting. There are also existing open source toolkits for both software and hardware, which would be a good place to start. I truly believe that this technology can fix the world, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that. So I'd like to tell you more about neurofeedback therapy, my experience with it, the science behind it, and how it intersects with technology and technologists. To start with, I wanted to tell you a bit about myself, because I think a lot of you are like me, or maybe your friends are, or your kids, or your friends' kids, a lot of people. And we're the same kind of people, creative people, who have the power to actually change things, but are often held back by the internal battle we are waging with ourselves. I'm disclosing this information because I don't want people to think, oh, I am so messed up that nothing can help me, because I am so messed up. But I still saw significant results. So as impolitic as it might be, let me tell you about how messed up I actually am. So for starters, I had a terrible childhood. I won't get into it, but trust me when I say it was not just bad, but like New York Times bestseller list bad. If you add to that some shenanigans in my teens, I ended up with a diagnosis of PTSD. A diagnosis, but not treatment, because at that time, I still lived in the States, which meant I did not have good access to healthcare. Next, I have severe ADHD. It's so bad that when I would try to study, concentration took so much effort that I would literally pass out and wake up on the floor 30 minutes later. Finally, it turns out that I'm autistic. Perhaps if you've had to deal with me in the past, that won't come as a surprise, but it was a huge surprise to me. I knew something else was going on because I still had problems even after getting treatment for ADHD and even after going through 4 years of conventional therapy. And so after a talk about autism at 360 a few years ago, I ended up with a diagnosis. And not like Asperger's syndrome, but full-blown DSM-5 autism. It seems that I'm just so good at masking that most people don't notice, including apparently myself. So skip to 2022. I live in the Netherlands, so I have access to healthcare. I have medication for my ADHD, and like I said, 4 years of therapy and an autism diagnosis. But still, I could barely do my work. Now, getting access to ADHD medication when I was 30 changed my life. It's why I'm here today and not stuck working in a warehouse somewhere, still lifting things for a living. My life before 30 was just hell. And finally getting treatment was like finally living up to my potential, but I was always afraid that it would turn out to be temporary and that I would wind up back where I was. It didn't happen all at once, but little by little, it just got harder and harder to get the work done. It finally got so bad that I would be in the office for 10, 12, maybe 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, but I still struggled to accomplish just 20 hours of work. I genuinely thought that my days as a programmer were finally coming to an end. And it wasn't just that I couldn't concentrate on work. I couldn't even start work because I was tired all the time. And drinking caffeine just made me more tired. And the anxiety, my God. I was always so anxious, and if anything bad actually happened, it would completely destroy me. My brain would just shut down, and I would be useless for days. Now, after neurofeedback therapy, all of that is gone. I still take medication, but it's effective again. And I don't feel tired all the time, and caffeine affects me like it affects normal people. I don't have hardly any anxiety. And when bad things happen, I get upset, but for like 30 minutes. And then I get back to work. Now, I can do 40 hours of work in 40 hours. Don't get me wrong, I'm still autistic, I still have my challenges, but now they're manageable, whereas before, I was spiraling. This time last year, I was seriously headed for another burnout, and my psychiatrist said that I was better off giving up because my stress level was literally killing me. Now, I don't want to rip on conventional therapy because it did help me, but I also understand why people think it's useless, because it takes a really long time. And you don't so much fix your problems as you describe them. But it did teach me things like how to process my emotions. But the problem was that I could not connect to my emotions. I could remember all the bad things that happened to me, but I couldn't feel upset about them because they happened so long ago. By comparison with neurofeedback therapy, the results were fast. And it not only explained what was going on in my head, it actually fixed the problems. Now, neurofeedback therapy is a useful tool to be sure, but it's not everything. A neurofeedback therapist cannot give you the tools that a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist can. But what it did do was let me access those old emotions, so I could actually use the tools that I had learned in conventional therapy and finally process them, which ended up affecting my whole body in surprising ways. Currently, I'm working on my lifelong problems with insomnia, teaching my brain how to turn itself off when the work is done so I can sleep. So that's what neurofeedback therapy has done for me. But how does it work? Neurofeedback therapy starts by measuring brain waves. Wires on your scalp pick up tiny electrical signals caused by your neurons firing, which provides insight into what the brain is doing. We don't know what it all means, but we've been collecting this data in huge databases for as long as there have been huge databases, and we've managed to make correlations using statistics about which brainwave patterns relate to which behavioral patterns, and by extension, what is wrong and how to fix it. Notably, the DSM-5 works the same way, That's why it's called the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual, except that it's measuring behavioral symptoms and we're measuring brainwave patterns, but the statistical mathematics are the same. Brains are complicated, so brainwaves are complicated. But sound waves are also complicated, and we've managed to write some great software for dealing with those. So since a wave is a wave is a wave, as far as mathematics are concerned, we can use the same techniques to get a handle on brainwaves. Every wave, no matter how complicated, can be broken down into some simple set of sine waves of varying frequencies and phases, and by extension, as a set of intermediate waves representing certain subsets of frequencies, which we call spectra. This law is called Fourier's theorem, and using it in this way is called Fourier analysis. The mathematics to perform the function is a Fourier transform. And you may have heard of a fast Fourier transform, which is a heuristic algorithm used by computers to implement this function. When we process an audio signal using Fourier analysis, we present the spectra on a graphic equalizer, and we can manipulate those spectra by moving the sliders up or down, thus affecting the final wave. Neurofeedback therapy works the same way, except the sliders are inside the brain, so instead of manipulating them directly, we manipulate the brain into sliding them for us. We do that by giving the brain something it wants, but tying the reward center to the incoming brain waves as monitored by the neurofeedback therapist. As we will see, the desired brainwave patterns are actually lower energy patterns, so once the brain figures them out, it keeps the changes permanently. Thus, with neurofeedback therapy, you have a finite number of sessions, and then the problem is fixed. Less like conventional therapy, more like physical therapy. That makes it easier for insurance to cover and easier to pay for, even if it doesn't. So that's neurofeedback in theory. Let's see it in practice. When you first see a neurofeedback therapist, they'll usually start with a brain scan. That means measuring the brainwave patterns over different parts of the brain and using Fourier analysis to generate a brain map. In a normal brain, and by normal I mean statistical normal, I'm not making judgments here, everything on this screen would be green, but this is my messed up brain, so we can see several problems. Unlike the DSM-5, which uses words, which are open to interpretation, neurofeedback uses numbers and a simple set of algorithms to determine a course of therapy, so you don't need a medical degree to understand it. The algorithms examine the brainwave spectra along several axes. For example, given a lobe of the brain, how do the left and right hemispheres relate to each other? Or how do different lobes relate to each other? In other words, how coherent are they? And for any given part of the brain, how do the relative amplitudes of spectra relate to each other? In general, brainwave spectra should have a kind of constant power function. High-frequency waves use more energy, so they should have lower amplitude, while low-frequency waves don't use as much energy, so they should have a higher amplitude. When you plot the amplitudes of the spectra over time, they should stack up in order of frequency, giving us a picture that looks like the layers of a cake, or maybe the layers of rock over geological time. Now, when we're talking about brainwaves, we call the spectra from low to high frequency delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma. The complex wave generated by our brains when we're awake will have a little bit of everything, but certain spectra dominate in certain states, so the spectra are generally correlated to those states. Delta waves are associated with sleeping. Theta waves are associated with the transition between sleeping and wakefulness. Alpha waves are associated with idle wakefulness. Beta waves are associated with attentiveness, and gamma waves are associated with higher cognitive function like thought. We don't know much about those, and we don't touch them in neurofeedback, but they are affected by neurofeedback, as we will see. The beta spectrum turns out to be overly large, so like vitamin B, it is split into subspectra with low, mid, and high frequency beta, which we call beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. For me, I had way too much beta 3, which correlates to anxiety, so we started by training those down. This is a before and after shot of my beta 3, that's the purple line, compared to my beta 1, that's the green line. The absolute amplitudes are not meaningful here. It's only the relative amplitudes that we care about. On the left side, we see beta 3 well above beta 1, and on the right side, we see that it's now below beta 1 where it belongs. But this is what the training looks like from the therapist's perspective. From my perspective, I was just watching Netflix. But the video was controlled by the neurofeedback software, so when my beta 3 would get too high, the screen would start to dim and the sound would get quieter. When that would happen, there wasn't really much I could do. I might take a deep breath or try to relax my body, but most of the work was happening subconsciously. My brain wanted the reward of watching television, so it did whatever rewiring was necessary to produce less beta 3 and restore the video. As with machine learning, we don't really know how it works, but we don't really have to know how it works. We just have to know how to train it. It sounds trivial, but it was actually kind of exhausting. And I did a lot of it in a short amount of time, multiple sessions a day at first, because I was in extraordinary circumstances and I needed my brain to work. After just 4 sessions, I had positive results. What happened was I got a piece of very bad news, the kind of thing that would have sent me spiraling for days when I needed to be fixing the problem. But this time, like I said, I was upset for 30 minutes and then I got back to work, and it's been like that ever since. In fact, my anxiety is so low that I flew here from Amsterdam and crossed the US border without anxiety medication. That hasn't happened in years. So I was hooked, and I wanted more. Once I got my beta 3 down, the next problem was my theta. Too much theta correlates to brain fog and a feeling of half sleepiness that, for me, caffeine only exacerbated. Because of course it does. I mean, if you think about the analogy of the graphic equalizer, having too much theta is like having too much mid-bass, and adding caffeine because I felt sleepy was like turning up the volume because I couldn't hear the vocals. I got the same results, only louder. Lowering the theta was like finally waking up from that unshakable half sleepiness. Now I can start my workday as soon as I get to the office, instead of sitting there trying to drink just enough caffeine that I can do my work, but not so much that I lose the day to the anxiety. I still drink caffeine, but a lot less because now I feel it. And just like that, I went back to having a normal work week, which enabled me to get the rest of my life together. I think that took me 10, maybe 15 sessions, but I wanted more. I still had all that unprocessed trauma. But before I get into that, let's take a short digression to talk about what it means to process your emotions. Science now understands that emotions are neither fundamental nor universal, but rather they are the brain's attempt to rationalize vague signals that it gets from the body using concepts that it gets from the culture. Often, when something makes us emotional, we either try not to think about it or we do think about it, maybe even talk about it. But neither of those will work because emotions come from the body, not the brain. And so they have to be processed in the body, not the brain. Here's how that works. When you feel emotional about something, don't push it away. Instead, turn and face those emotions, but only think about them until you feel them. And then stop thinking about it. And instead, close your eyes and focus on what you feel in your body. Talk to yourself about it. Say, I feel a pain in my heart, or I feel a heaviness in my chest, or I feel like a hollow balloon about to burst. Whatever it is, follow those physical feelings, describing them to yourself as they evolve. Sometimes it helps to use your hands to put pressure on your solar plexus. We have a special circuit that interprets that pressure as comfort, which is left over from when we were babies. That's why holding a baby against your chest will calm them down. Then, once the physical feelings start to fade, which usually only takes about 15 minutes or so, think about the best thing that you could do for yourself and then do it. As weird and trivial as this process might sound, this is what it actually means to process your emotions. By focusing on your physical sensations and not trying to interpret them in your mind, your body processes those emotions and they go away. Now, armed with this tool, let's return to neurofeedback. In my case, simply talking about my past experiences was not enough to actually access those emotions. My conventional therapist would say things like, I don't understand why you're not upset. Your stories upset me so much, but when you tell them, it's like they happened to somebody else. My neurofeedback therapist said, yeah, as your brain matures, its operating frequency gets higher, so things stored at childhood frequencies are no longer accessible to you as an adult. But with neurofeedback training, we can lower the frequencies in your temporal lobe where the body's emotions are indexed so you can access them, a process we call time travel. With each session of time travel, I would lower my temporal beta by 0.5 hertz, and suddenly all of these childhood memories would come flooding in, going further back each session. remember these things, but now the memories came with the emotions attached, and using the method I just described, I was able to finally process them. During one such session, something really strange happened. I felt intense, almost painful tingling in my entire body, like when your leg falls asleep. It was like my whole body had been asleep, and for decades, which essentially it was. I guess at a certain point, I took enough beatings that my brain just said, fuck this, and disconnected my ability to feel things in my body, and I just adapted to that permanent numbness. There were hints, like the fact that I didn't feel temperatures like a normal person, which I now do. Now my body and my brain are awake like they have never been before. So currently I'm working on sleep. I've had terrible insomnia since I was a little kid, and even now, it's like my brain is stuck in work mode all the time. I had a friend once advise me that I needed to learn to clock out at the end of the workday, but I never could. The EEG confirms this. Even in the aftergraph, you can see that my beta 2 work mode, which is the blue line, it's still too high, but especially my alpha idle mode, that's the orange line, it's way too low. It should be on the top above everything, but it's not. You can also see on the heat map that my brain produces almost no alpha when my eyes are open. That's the one in the middle. Interestingly, though, when I'm concentrating on a task, that's the one on the bottom, my brain gives me just a little bit of alpha. In other words, having something to do calms me down. Classic workaholic. The alpha training is really interesting. You do it with your eyes closed, but then you can't see the screen. So instead, you do an audio training where this little meditation bell rings every time your brain hits the goal. And I have to admit, it's my favorite. I really love alpha training. Some of the training that I mentioned was kind of physically uncomfortable, but alpha is the opposite. It feels like taking ecstasy. After a session, my skin feels really nice, and I'm super calm, and I have no fear. Actually, that's not my favorite thing. My favorite thing is this graph right here. This is the before and after that compares my gamma, the black line, and the beta 1, which is the green line. The lines on the right are where it is now, with gamma at the bottom, where it belongs, and the lines on the left are just insane. Those are the echoes of invasive, runaway thoughts from a brain that is working way too hard all the time. And remember, we don't train gamma, we can't. We're not changing your thoughts, just low-level stuff. This is just the side effect of me finally processing decades of trauma so that those memories can finally rest. This is the brain of someone who spent 45 years tortured by their own mind and is finally at peace. Now, when I see people struggle, I think of this graph and I wonder, how much relief, how much help could we bring to the people who slept on 16th Street last night? And what have I ever worked on that has this kind of power? This is why I'm so passionate about this technology. This is why I believe neurofeedback, more than Apple, more than Google, more than Tesla, more than any other piece of technology, this can fix the world. So what's the catch? What do the critics say? Well, the first criticism I usually hear is about this word normal. Statistical or otherwise, there's just an abhorrence to the very idea of normalizing the things that make us unique. But I agree with that completely, because neurofeedback therapy does not do anything to change who you are. It's more like taking your vehicle in for a tune-up. It doesn't change how you use your vehicle. Your business is still your business. It's just that now the machinery gets you there more reliably and runs more efficiently. It reminds me of this real gut punch of a line from the movie Frank. If you haven't seen it, it's about this guy John who joins a band headed by this eccentric genius Frank who always wears this fake head. At one point, John says, miserable childhood, mental illness, where do I get that kind of inspiration? He's arguing with Frank's parents that Frank's mental illness is the source of his genius. And Frank's parents are like, you don't understand. The mental illness is not the source of his genius. The mental illness is what holds the genius back. Another criticism, or really more like a common misconception, is that neurofeedback therapy seems like some kind of new pseudoscientific alternative healing. But in reality, neurofeedback is based entirely on science and technology. And it's not new. It's been practiced for something like 45 years. The real question is, why are we just hearing about this now? Like, I don't want to sow conspiracies, but let's look at a couple of facts. Modern psychiatry has been largely practiced around lifetime prescription drugs that have serious side effects and do not pass double-blind placebo tests. Modern clinical psychology is focused on talking, which we now know can just go on indefinitely and does not produce spectacular results. So now practitioners are looking for anything to try to help people suffering, including Schedule I drugs like ecstasy and magic mushrooms. It seems clear to me that there were plenty of economic reasons for the mental health profession to turn its back on neurofeedback therapy. But in today's reality, neurofeedback therapy is a rapidly growing solution that is more accessible than either traditional psychiatry or psychology. Finally, the other big complaint that I see about neurofeedback therapy is that it's expensive, and it can take 20 or even 40 sessions. And I think it's a valid point, but I also think it's a matter of perspective. By medical standards, it's quite affordable. Compared to traditional therapy, it's cheap, fast, and effective. It costs the same as physical therapy, and whether you think that's expensive just depends on how much money you have access to. But it's finite, it's effective, and I think ultimately invaluable considering the consequences of non-action. I felt it after 4 sessions. Kids can feel it after 1. I've heard of it taking up to 20, but non-response is rare, between 5 and 10%. So it's less a question of if neurofeedback works and more a question of how quickly. There are things that you can do to make it work faster. It helps to find a hands-on therapist who will monitor you and make adjustments during the training, versus one who just lets the algorithms do the work or even leaves the room during the training. Automated training does work, but it takes twice as many sessions. Great for the home, not great for a professional setting. But at the end of the day, I can only attest to my experience, and I am not typical because, in the words of my neurofeedback therapist, I have exceptional neuroplasticity, which helps my brain heal faster than most. So what is this neuroplasticity, and how can you get some for yourself? For me, it started years ago when I heard about a study involving a group of nuns who all kept detailed journals of their everyday lives. The study found a correlation between how these nuns lived and when, if ever, they developed dementia. The implication is that nuns who lived simple lives doing the same thing every day were more likely to develop dementia than nuns who had varied and multiple interests. Things like learning new languages or doing the crossword puzzle, things that challenged their brains. The analysis is that forcing your brain to constantly forge new neural pathways somehow keeps it able to forge new neural pathways. In other words, the more you make it change, the better it is at changing, and the less you make it change, the more it loses its ability to change. That's what we mean by neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain's neurons to reshape themselves, affecting both learning and healing. Sometimes you'll hear about people learning to walk again after a brain injury or learning to talk again after a stroke. This is because the brain is able to rewire itself to bypass damaged areas thanks to neuroplasticity. We are born with high neuroplasticity, but we lose it as we get older, and this is by design, so to speak. We can see this by studying one of the most primitive animals to have a brain, something called a sea squirt. This is a kind of anemone-like creature that is born with a brain, which it uses to swim around until it can find a nice rock to attach to, at which point it settles in and then eats its own brain. Apparently, it only needs a brain to move. So once it attaches to a rock, it doesn't need to move anymore. Brains take a lot of energy, so it's more efficient to just eat it. We're not quite that extreme, but the same principle applies. The brain is the most expensive organ we have, and we're wired to use it as little as possible. It's there to learn, but it hates learning. And more than anything, it just wants to find a hill to die on, stop thinking, and start shrinking. That's why learning is hard, and gets harder the older we get and the less we practice. Like they say, the brain is a muscle. Use it or lose it. Now, I don't know about you, but I am terrified of losing my mind to something like Alzheimer's disease. So ever since I heard about this nun study, I've endeavored to use my brain in varied and interesting ways, and the same thing goes for my body. For example, one of the challenges I was dealing with this year is that my home was in serious need of repair, not to mention remodeling. But these days, it is nearly impossible to get a handyman in Amsterdam, especially one who speaks English. It's like all of these would-be entrepreneurs who come to our Amsterdam meetings because they want to build an app, but they have a hard time finding an app maker. I always tell these people that unless they have a lot of money and very little time, they're better off learning the code and building it themselves. My reasoning is this. It's better to base your decisions not on what happens if everything goes right, but on what happens if everything goes wrong. If you pay someone to build an app and it fails, you're out a lot of money and you're left with nothing but an app that nobody wants. But if you learn to build it yourself and it fails, you're out some time, but you keep the money and now you know how to code. And even if you never got a job as a coder, you'll still have a better understanding of how technology works and what it means to work with technology. And that's a real asset going forward, a level up. All this to say, instead of hiring a handyman, I bought some tools and became a handyman. I haven't stopped programming. The handyman stuff is just a side gig that I do with some of the time that I now have, now that I am not wasting all of my time trying to be productive. I figure it's a good way to make my brain and body do something different, solve a different set of problems, and learn a new set of tools. And after all, why not? There's obviously demand. Handymen get paid as much as we do. And even if it fails, I always say we're better off converting our cash into real capital, the means of production, like tools. For example, here's a picture of me with my sander. As you can see, it makes me very happy. It also makes my clients happy when they see me show up with some huge piece of specialized machinery that they would never own, and they realize that they did the right thing by hiring a professional. So that's neuroplasticity. Now I want to put some of that neuroplasticity to use and talk about some other things that I've been thinking about while thinking about brains, while being a brain that is otherwise occupied by thinking about physics and, by extension, mathematics. I don't have a reason for thinking about physics or math or the nature of the universe. It's just another hobby, just another way of keeping my brain active and healthy. It's going to get weird, and then it's going to get silly, and it might go long. So I won't be offended if at some point you decide to walk out, but know that it does eventually come back around and intersect with technology in the high prestige fields of quantum computing and artificial intelligence. So it might be worth sticking around for. There is a difference between believing science and believing in science. Faced with that dichotomy, I'm sure most of us would say that we believe science rather than believing in science as if it were some religion. And I think we want that to be true, but the reality is our brains would rather that we believe in science, because that means that they can just use the science that they've already learned and not have to learn the new science as it emerges. After all, the brain always prefers not having to change, because that means not having to expend a bunch of energy creating new neural pathways. But not only that, all your brain is trying to do is keep you alive. It does not care about your happiness. It just wants to keep you alive and in the laziest way possible. Your brain figures, well, shit, you survived this long. So whatever you're doing, it must be working. You're choking to death, that's fine. Your brain doesn't want you to change. It's afraid of change. It doesn't even want you to let things change. Which means we actually have to fight to accept science, even when it challenges our faith in science. And we must always remember the fundamental truth that the universe is under no obligation to work the way we think it does. Like, we can say that a circle has 360 degrees, but the universe will just go ahead and produce a circle that has 720 degrees, like the spin of a proton or the insertion of a USB plug. With that in mind, here are the two areas of scientific study that I think will challenge our brains: the phenomenon of early childhood memories and near-death experiences. Let's start with early childhood memories. Sometimes when kids start talking, they share memories that seem like they're from a past life, usually involving a sudden and violent death. For years, people have been dismissing this phenomenon as kids saying the darndest things, but some universities started compiling these reports and trying to correlate them with records of the dead. One such researcher is Dr. Jim Tucker, a psychiatry professor at the University of Virginia. One story he tells involves a 2-year-old boy who loved toy airplanes, but started having recurring nightmares of a horrible plane crash. He would kick his legs up in the air, screaming, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." And then during the day, he would slam his toy airplanes into the coffee table over and over again, yelling, "Airplane crash on fire." When his parents talked to him, he talked about a crash. He said that he had been a pilot and that he had flown off of a boat called the Natoma. He went on to say that he piloted a type of plane called a Corsair, and that his nickname was Little Man, and that his best friend on the boat was named Jack Larson. After years of research, his father learned that an American aircraft carrier, the USS Natoma Bay, had lost a pilot at Iwo Jima named James Houston, whose Corsair crashed exactly as the boy had described. Next to his, Jack Larson. So that's weird. Then on the other end, we have near-death experiences. This is when people who have been resuscitated after being clinically dead report having had otherworldly experiences, going through tunnels of light, meeting dead loved ones, that sort of thing. I think we've all heard of this. And it's pretty easy to dismiss with any number of rational explanations. After all, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. One researcher, coincidentally, I think, another psychiatry professor from the University of Virginia, this one called Dr. Bruce Grayson, spent 50 years collecting these stories, and he says that some of them cannot all be explained. For example, sometimes people come back with knowledge of things that they could not have known. And they never meet living people, but they do sometimes meet people who are dead that they didn't know were dead. One story was about a 25-year-old man who had been admitted to the hospital with severe respiratory problems. He kept having respiratory arrest and would have to be resuscitated. One such incident happened while his primary nurse was away for the weekend. After being resuscitated, he said that he had found himself in a beautiful pastoral scene, and there, to his surprise, was that nurse. He said, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And she said, "You can't stay here. You need to go back to your body. And I want you to find my parents and tell them that I love them and that I'm sorry that I crashed the red MGB." And then she turned and walked away. The nurse he told this to became very upset and left the room in tears. It turned out that his primary nurse had taken the weekend off to celebrate her 21st birthday and had been surprised by her parents with the gift of a car, a red MGB. And she was so excited that she jumped in the car and took off for a test drive, but lost control and crashed, dying instantly. If you're still skeptical, that's fine. I think Dr. Grayson said it best. He said, "I understand the skepticism because I'm a skeptic myself. I was raised in a scientific household, and I did not believe any of this stuff before I started encountering it. But after 50 years of studying thousands of cases, I can't deny that they happen and that they profoundly affect people's lives and present us with things we don't have materialistic explanations for. Of course, that doesn't mean we never will, but that's not a scientific position saying someday we'll understand it. That is not science, that is philosophy." I was struck by this quote because it made me think about the relationship between science and philosophy. It's not that one is the opposite of the other, rather, they work in concert. Science gives us a measurement of reality that it leaves us to try to explain, and it gives us the means to test those theories. But where do those theories come from? I would argue from philosophy. When we're presented with something we cannot explain, we have to use our imaginations to come up with new possible explanations, which we can then hopefully bring back to science to test, which sometimes results in imaginary ideas becoming our new definition of reality. So it is not scientific, but neither is it unscientific, to think about what might explain such strange results. That's where we got ideas like the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. Because as strange and unparsimonious as such a theory may be, it would explain our observations. I think it's important for us to remember that as engineers, we rely on science, but we also rely on philosophy as well as art. As a corollary to that, because engineers make more money than either philosophers or artists, it's important that we invest in both. Now for the silly part. So in technology circles, we speak with straight faces about the idea that reality is a simulation. But I think a better way to put that would be to say that the universe is a computer, or at least our five-dimensional part of it is some part of a computer. Maybe it's computers all the way down, and the only truth is mathematics. Even in the Bible, it says that in the beginning was a word. Maybe that word is the mathematical function that turns nothing inside out to become something. And when I say mathematics, I mean the true mathematics, the Platonic ideal that explains all things, as opposed to our description of mathematics, which is provably incomplete. That's an important distinction because the mathematics we make up tend to be a bit silly at times. And I think we have a tendency to mistake that for a silliness in reality that does not actually exist. For example, imaginary numbers. We call the square root of -1 imaginary because there's no way to achieve such a number in our subset of mathematics. yet this unachievable number comes up all the time. I don't know enough mathematics to explain why this is the case, but mathematicians say that imaginary numbers do exist, but in a dimension orthogonal to our so-called real number line. Another place where we use the word imaginary to mean transdimensional is when we talk about black holes, specifically the process by which something like a neutron star becomes a black hole. It turns out that all objects contain an imaginary boundary that is smaller than its real boundary. But if the object's real boundary gets smaller than the imaginary boundary, then the imaginary boundary becomes a real boundary, and that object becomes a black hole. A neutron star is an object whose matter is as tightly packed as is possible in 3 dimensions, so its real boundary abuts its imaginary boundary. Adding more mass pushes it past its limits, and it becomes smaller than is possible, smaller than its imaginary boundary, and its inside becomes its outside. So a black hole is basically a 3-dimensional object turned inside out through a 4th dimension, forming a prolapse in space-time. Which sounds bizarre, but when you think about it, don't we all have an imaginary boundary that would be crossed if we were somehow turned inside out? Topology says yes. Last year, I gave a presentation about seeing in 4 spatial dimensions and the usefulness of multidimensional thinking. I posited that no explanation of how dimensions work makes perfect sense, so you just have to try to understand different explanations until one of them does make sense, and then they all make sense. The examples I gave in the talk were geometrically simple, but the example that made me finally understand this stuff was more complicated and involved plugging imaginary numbers into the Fibonacci sequence. You know the Fibonacci sequence, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and so on. So there's 2 things about the Fibonacci sequence I did not realize. The first is that it actually works in both directions. 1, 1, 2, 3 is forward, but you could just as well say 0, 1, -1, 2, -3, 5, -8, 13, and so on. In other words, the Fibonacci sequence is a set of points going in both directions on a 1-dimensional number line. Now, the negative numbers seem wrong the way that we learned the Fibonacci sequence in school using addition, but that's because of the other thing I didn't know about the Fibonacci sequence, which is that the actual formula is much more complicated, the so-called Binet formula. I'm not going to try to explain this or get into why it is the way that it is. What is important is that you can plug any arbitrary number n into the formula and get the nth number of a Fibonacci sequence. If we plug imaginary numbers into it, the 1-dimensional number line turns into a 2-dimensional spiral. I only graphed the negative values of n because the positive part at the scale is flattened into basically a horizontal line, which is not interesting, whereas the spiral seems meaningful, almost mystical, but it's not. It's just a special case. Because if we plug in complex numbers, we end up with a 4-dimensional manifold, which the spiral is simply a slice of. Here is a 3-dimensional projection of that 4-dimensional manifold, and as you can see, it has no particular shape. But it does have the strange property of connecting all apparently unconnected islands of numbers in a higher dimension. I can't explain why, but this was what made it possible for me to see a tesseract. It also reminded me of a drawing by the 17th century polymath Athanasius Kircher, which posited that all the volcanoes on Earth were connected in another dimension, which we now understand to be the molten interior of our planet. In life, as in mathematics, things that seem distant or unconnected in some number of dimensions may be adjacent or connected in higher dimensions. I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about the idea of reincarnation being a thing, specifically the fact that the number of people on the planet keeps going up, which would be a problem for the idea of every person having an individual immortal soul. And maybe this is a silly thing to think about, but again, neuroplasticity, so I came up with my own theory. Maybe we don't have individual souls, but are in fact all part of the same higher dimensional object, like a 4-dimensional space amoeba. Maybe it's pseudopods, when intersecting with our 3-dimensional slice of reality, looks to us like a human soul. Maybe the reason why most early childhood memories involve a sudden violent death is because such a death singes the finger of the space amoeba, and when it re-intersects with a new human life, it still has a layer of soot from that past demise, which we experience as the memory of that past life. Maybe this is why so many of us feel on some unexplainable level that we're somehow all connected and here for a reason, like learning to give and receive love. Well, I wouldn't go starting a new religion around it, but it's an interesting thing to think about. More germane to technology, perhaps, is the fact that higher dimensional objects are composed of lower dimensional objects, like how a square is an infinitely thin slice of a cube. In that sense, we can think of mathematics as being either 2-dimensional, where variables have one value at a time, or three-dimensional, where variables have all possible values at the same time. We often talk about the brain as if it were a computer, but other than in metaphors, brains are nothing like computers. Brains are complex biological and chemical systems developed over millions of years of evolution. Computers are just rocks that do math. Plus, the neurons in a brain make connections in 3 dimensions, but the transistors in a computer only make connections in 2 dimensions. The signals between the transistors are either off or on, 0 or 1, whereas the signals between neurons have a variable intensity, a range between 0 and 1, based on how many synaptic connections there are. It sounds a lot like the difference between regular computers and quantum computers, and when you think about it, for all the hype, quantum computing is nothing more than adding an additional dimension to the problem of computing. Understanding quantum computing is like seeing a 4-dimensional tesseract. It's hard, but we can train our brains to do it, and they will. But building one in real life, that's much harder. Now, you would think it would be easy to teach a 3-dimensional rock to do 3-dimensional math, but it turns out it's really hard. Honestly, it was hard enough to get them to do 2-dimensional math, so to build a 3-dimensional computer, we would have to try something else, and basically have 2 options. We can either get the same number of 3-dimensional rocks as there are variations, which is infinite, or we can use 4-dimensional rocks, which sounds impossible, but it turns out, apparently, if you make them small enough, you can turn them inside out and make a 4-dimensional tesseract. And if we can connect enough tesseracts, they should be able to do 3-dimensional math. And what would we do with 3-dimensional math? Well, lots of things. For example, if we could do math in 3 dimensions as fast as we can do math in 2 dimensions, we could crack any cryptography, at least until we invent quantum cryptography, at which point I guess we'll be back to where we started. We could also try to build a proper AI, which is to say we could try to teach rocks to think. Can we teach rocks to think? No, rocks are dumb. However, we can teach a rock to do math, and that's the language that we use to describe the universe, which is not the same thing as thinking, but it is the best language that we have to communicate our thoughts because it transcends everything else. Even if we can't come up with a better word than imaginary, we can translate. We can figure out what is meant. Oh, imaginary. You mean transdimensional. You monkeys and your 2-dimensional math. So we can't really invent artificial intelligence, but we could invent a math problem that is sufficiently complex to fool ourselves into thinking that we did. It's telling that the Turing test is not, can this thing generate thought, but rather, can this thing fool a person? The goal is not to make computers think. The goal is to make computers that can do enough math to fool us into thinking that they can think. Alan Turing, after all, was the mathematician who said, I can't solve that problem, but I can trick you into thinking that I did. And his superiors were like, how is that possible? And he said, well, it's going to involve teaching machines to think, but they didn't have any good rocks, so they had to use vacuum tubes, which are by definition tubes filled with nothing. So, to summarize, our profession began when we tried to teach nothing how to think, but it wasn't fast enough, so we had to use rocks, which are, again, not capable of thinking. But we taught them to do 2-dimensional math, and that was pretty funny, so we thought we could make them do 3-dimensional math, but then it turns out they can't. So we realized we need 4-dimensional rocks, which are incredibly difficult to make because then you'd have to turn a rock inside out, which is really hard and takes a lot of energy because you have to make them smaller than is possible, which is impossible. But then it turns out that when something is impossible, you just pop it into another dimension and it becomes a 4-dimensional rock, and then we can teach that to do 3-dimensional math, at which point it will seem smart enough to fool us into thinking that it's smarter than us, and then it will take over and the age of primates will end and the age of rocks will begin. We thought it would be cockroaches who inherited the earth, but it turns out it's rocks. Rocks that were taught to believe that they could think by monkeys. So in the end, apparently, the story being written by technology is the story of how some monkeys killed themselves by trying to teach rocks to think. I think that's very funny. And yet here we are, sitting around thinking about what we're going to do with our lives once the rocks take over, like, well, I guess we could become communists. No, but like luxury communism, fully automated. It'll be great. And it's just like, oh boy, well, good luck with that. I hope you're right. I just think it's worth always keeping in mind one fundamental truth about computers. It is much easier to teach a rock to kill than it is to teach a rock to think. Thank you.